My name is Sandra Eder, and I'm an associate professor in the history department at the University of California, Berkeley. And this is my book, How the Clinic Made Gender, the Medical History of a Transformative Idea, which came out this year with University of Chicago Press. In my book, I tell the story of how gender was invented within US medicine in the mid-20th century. And I show how the idea of a learned gender role transformed over the span of 3 decades within the clinic and outside the clinic. And it starts in the 1940s when physicians and endocrinologists and psychologists and psychiatrists increasingly focus on determining the sex a child with intersex traits could live in, and whose role they could fulfill, rather than like they did before, by focusing on finding somebody's true sex, genetic, gonadal, or otherwise. And they increasingly argued that physicians should just assign a sex, and that these children would learn their gender role in the course of growing up, and then gender role would become fixed over time. And this new idea went hand in hand with treatment guidelines that recommended to surgically adjust these children's bodies to fit their assigned sex, which had traumatic and traumatic consequences for these patients. In the book, I talk about how gender was a particular American reformulation of sex and how it was shaped by shifts in the kind of cyclicization of everyday life and sex in the first half of the 20th century. And it was also informed by belief in social engineering that became dominant in the period after the Second World War. And what's really surprising to me that one might think that gender carried a radical meaning in its original formulation, but quite to the contrary. Gender in its conception and birth at the clinic was an inherently normative concept, because it was no longer rooted in anatomy, it was linked to the norms of masculinity and femininity at the time. I also show how gender gained a life of its own after it left the clinic, and how its meanings proliferated in the decades after it was first formulated in the clinic at the Johns Hopkins Hospital. In psychology, gender role was reformulated as gender identity, which then became the name that was ascribed to gender identity clinics in the late 1960s. And then by the early 1970s, feminist activists and artists and queer communities really critically engaged with the medical and scientific ideas of learned gender roles and of gender identity. And they increasingly use gender often in combination with provocative terminology to question and disrupt and to queer traditional stereotypes of masculinity and femininity. That's it. I hope you enjoyed the book, and thank you for listening.